J.P. Morgan had a bath installed on the Titanic. Not a standard ship's bath, a private bath, in a private suite, with specially designed holders built into the walls. For his cigars. He never used it. Now here is my question for you. Do you think J.P. Morgan knew the Titanic was going to sink? Or was he just lucky? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know what you think before you've heard everything I'm about to tell you. Because what I found when I started pulling this apart wasn't what the internet says. The popular version of this story is almost entirely wrong, and the true documented version, the one sitting inside Senate inquiry transcripts and Lloyd's of London insurance records, is stranger than the theory it replaced. I want to take you through it carefully because this story deserves careful. I came across this the way I come across most things, sideways. I was researching the financial panic of 1907, trying to understand how one man could essentially be the entire backstop of the American banking system. The man was J.P. Morgan, and somewhere in that research, a footnote caught my eye. It mentioned that Morgan had attended the launch of the Titanic in May 1911. He had watched it enter the water. He had commissioned a personal suite aboard it, and then, weeks before it sailed, he had quietly removed a collection of his fine art from the cargo hold and canceled his booking. I wrote that down, and I kept going. Here is what the documented record actually shows. The RMS Titanic was built at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Ireland, by roughly 14,000 workers, and completed at a cost of approximately $7.5 million in 1912. She was one of three sister ships in the Olympic class: the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic. The ships were not identical twins. The Titanic had an enclosed A-deck promenade with retractable glass screens. The Olympic's was open all the way along. The Titanic's wheelhouse front was flat. The Olympic's was curved. These were not small differences. They were structural and visible, documented in Harland and Wolff's own construction photographs. The Olympic, the older sister, had a difficult early life. On September 20th, 1911, she collided with the Royal Navy warship HMS Hawke in Southampton Water. The inquiry blamed the Olympic. She was repaired, returned to service, and came back to Belfast for further maintenance in March 1912, just weeks before Titanic was due to sail. That is the factual sequence. Both ships were briefly in the same yard. That proximity became the seed of a theory. The theory goes like this. The White Star Line secretly swapped the two ships, sending the damaged Olympic out as Titanic on the maiden voyage, planning for her to sink and collect the insurance. Robin Gardner laid this out in his 1998 book, and it spread. It is, by search volume, one of the most consumed alternative history topics on the planet. I spent time verifying this claim. It collapses. Here is precisely why. The Titanic was insured for $5 million. Her construction cost was $7.5 million. That is a documented gap of $2.5 million, roughly $70 million in today's money, that the White Star Line would have absorbed as a direct loss even if the insurance paid out in full. This is not my figure. This comes from Bruce Ismay's own testimony before the United States Senate inquiry, from the Lloyd's of London insurance records, and from a New York Times report dated April 28, 1912, which itemized the exact insurance breakdown. The White Star Line self-insured part of its fleet. Sinking the Titanic was not a profitable act. It was a financially ruinous one. Beyond the money, there is the physical evidence. Every piece of equipment on both ships was stamped with the yard number during construction. Titanic was yard number 401. Olympic was 400. Every artifact recovered from the wreck site, confirmed by Robert Ballard's 1985 expedition, and every subsequent exploration carries the number 401. The ship at the bottom of the North Atlantic is Titanic. The switch theory also requires the silence of thousands of workers, inspectors, and casual visitors who moved through the open Harland and Wolff yard every single week while both ships were there. No credible primary account of a swap was ever documented. The popular version of this story is wrong, but here is what I keep coming back to. The theory collapses, but the facts that gave it oxygen do not. J.P. Morgan owned the White Star Line through his company, the International Mercantile Marine Group, which he had acquired in 1902. He commissioned his personal suite on the Titanic. He attended the ship's launch in May 1911 as an honored guest. His suite had that private bath, that private promenade deck, those cigar holders in the walls. And then he canceled. Titanic expert George Behe, after 45 years of researching the disaster, told Reuters in 2021 he had never been able to find a single authoritative 1912 source clearly explaining why Morgan canceled. Not one. The reasons offered are these. Morgan fell ill and wanted to take spa treatments in France. He was also spending time with his mistress. One of his biographers suggested France was changing its laws to prevent Americans from exporting art treasures, and Morgan needed to be in Paris to move his purchases out of the country before the new laws took effect. Perhaps it was all three. But none of these explanations has a clean, primary source attached to it. What is documented is that Morgan pulled his fine art from Titanic's cargo hold before departure. He was not the only prominent figure to cancel. Milton Hershey, the chocolate magnate, had paid a $300 deposit by personal check for passage on the maiden voyage. He left Europe early on the America instead, because he was needed at his factory. Henry Clay Frick, the steel magnate, booked a suite. His wife sprained her ankle on a cruise, and they canceled. Ambassador Robert Bacon had planned to sail home to America on Titanic. A delay in the arrival of his replacement as ambassador to France pushed his departure back. The Vanderbilts canceled because, according to family accounts, someone in the family objected to sailing on a maiden voyage. Each cancellation has a plausible explanation. Each person had a clear reason documented somewhere. Except Morgan. His explanation has never been pinned to a single contemporaneous document. There are multiple theories held by multiple historians, each citing different sources, none of them primary. That is not evidence of wrongdoing. I want to be precise about that. The absence of a clear record is not proof of foreknowledge, but it is a gap, and it is a gap that sits in an uncomfortable place inside a much larger documented story. Now, I need to introduce you to someone, because this story is about to stop being about billionaires and become something else entirely. Isidor Straus was 67 years old on the night of April 14, 1912. He was the co-owner of Macy's department store and a former member of the United States House of Representatives. He and his wife Ida had been married for 40 years. They shared the same birthday, February 6th. They had spent the winter of 1911 to 1912 at Cape Martin in southern France, exchanging marconograms with their son as the ships passed near each other at sea. Isidore, by every account, was a gentleman who had publicly spoken in favor of centralized banking, in favor, not against, in the New York Times the previous year. Conspiracy theories have tried to put Isidor Straus in the category of J.P. Morgan's enemies. The claim is that he, along with John Jacob Astor and Benjamin Guggenheim, were targeted because they opposed the creation of the Federal Reserve. George Behe, of the Titanic Historical Society, spent 45 years searching the documentary record and found no evidence that Astor or Guggenheim ever took a public position on the Federal Reserve. The theory that these men were murdered to clear the path for central banking is not only unverified, it is contradicted by the only primary source we have, which is Straus's own public statements. But what happened to Isidore and Ida Straus that night is real. It is documented by multiple first-hand witnesses. When the Titanic began to sink, and the lifeboats were being loaded, Isidore and Ida approached Lifeboat 8 together. The officer in charge was prepared to allow both of them aboard. Isidore refused. He would not, he said, take a place before any other man on that ship. Ida was offered her seat again. She stepped out of the lifeboat. She looked at her husband and said, and this is from the account of Colonel Archibald Gracie, a survivor who witnessed it firsthand, "We have lived together for many years. Where you go, I go." She gave her mink fur coat to her maid, Ellen Bird. As Bird entered the lifeboat, she told her to keep it. She would not be needing it. They were last seen sitting side by side in deck chairs on the boat deck, holding each other in the dark as the ship went down around them. Isidore's body was recovered. In his pocket was a gold and onyx locket, sealed so tightly against the cold water that the photographs inside were barely damaged. 2 photographs, his eldest son Jesse and his eldest daughter, Sarah. Ida's body was never found. The family, decades later, collected water from the wreck site and placed it in an urn in the Straus Mausoleum at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. It is still there. The inscription on the cenotaph outside is taken from the Song of Solomon, chapter 8, verse 7. "Many waters cannot quench love. Neither can the floods drown it." That inscription was chosen by people who knew them. Now, let me compress everything into a sequence, because patterns become visible when you hold the events end to end. The September 1911 Olympic collides with HMS Hawke. The inquiry blames the Olympic. The White Star Line absorbs the financial damage. The October 1911 Olympic returns to Belfast for repairs, the first time both ships are in the same yard. The December 1911 Titanic nears completion. Harland and Wolff's own photographer, Robert Welch, is moving through the yard continuously, photographing both ships in detail. No photographic evidence of any modification to deceive inspectors is ever found. The January 1912. On behalf of broker Willis Faber and Company, the Titanic is insured at Lloyd's of London for $5 million against a construction cost of $7.5 million. A gap of $2.5 million the White Star Line carries itself. The March 1912 Olympic returns to Belfast for further maintenance. The April 1, 1912, J.P. Morgan removes his fine art from Titanic's cargo hold. The April 10, 1912, Titanic departs Southampton on her maiden voyage, carrying 2,228 passengers and crew. Morgan is not among them. His suite is occupied by J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line, who will survive by taking a lifeboat. The April 14th to 15th, 1912, at 11:40 p.m., Titanic strikes an iceberg. She sinks in 2 hours and 40 minutes. 1,517 people die. Isidore and Ida Strauss die together on deck, arm in arm. The April 17th, 1912, 2 days after the sinking, J.P. Morgan celebrates his 75th birthday at the spa resort of Aix-les-Bains, France. The April 28, 1912, the New York Times reports the insurance settlement. The ship was underinsured. The White Star Line suffers a documented loss. The April 30, 1912, Bruce Ismay testifies before the United States Senate. He confirms the valuation and the insurance gap on the record. The insurance fraud theory collapses on these numbers. The switch did not happen. The evidence is clear. The ship at the bottom of the Atlantic is Titanic. The finances make fraud impossible. The workforce makes secrecy impossible. The wreck itself makes doubt impossible. Those are the facts. But Morgan's bath is still sitting in the original design documents at the Harland and Wolff archive in Belfast. The cigar holders are described in the specifications. The suite was built. The art was removed. The cancellation was real. Most people telling this story get lost in the conspiracy. They inflate what cannot be proven and ignore what can. What can be proven is stranger and sadder than any insurance fraud. 1,517 people died on a ship that was not worth sinking, owned by a man who did not sail on it, for reasons that to this day remain precisely as murky as they were on April 16, 1912, when the survivors were still being pulled from the water. Ida Strauss never needed her coat again. There is a cenotaph in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx that you could visit today. Ida is not buried there. There is nothing to bury, but her name is on the stone beside her husband's. The water from the wreck site is in an urn inside the mausoleum. Her body is still somewhere in the North Atlantic. And here is what I cannot resolve, no matter how many times I go back through the record. J.P. Morgan owned the ship. He built himself a bath. He attended the launch. I am not saying he knew. I am saying no one has proven he did not. And those are very different sentences. So here is the question I want to leave you with. And I genuinely want you to think about this before you answer. If the truth about why Morgan canceled is sitting in a document that has simply not yet been found, would you want to know what it says? And if so, why does it matter to you? If this kind of careful, documented history is what you're looking for, subscribe. This channel exists to ask the questions that the official version leaves open.